Hey, everybody, welcome. It is Sunday Stories. And here's a story that we all need to understand. But more than anything, I want to share the story and the visionaries so that we can understand. I am truly impressed with the vision and truly excited about us understanding and unfolding the value proposition that this story allows all of us to share in our lives. When you think about a time that they want to erase, when we think about the fact that they want our history hidden from us, the fact that we're not necessarily history seekers, it is very, very important that we meet those storytellers who are beginning to share an insight that we possibly could miss. So if nothing else, let us take this moment to have this Sunday story unfolded in the shores of the annals of our own history. There's still a little bit of the title. Dr. Charles Chavis, welcome to Sunday Story here on Rolling Out.
Thank you so much for having me, Mr. Sneed. Thank you, sir.
You're welcome. When you first heard a little bit nuances about this story, where were you and what touched you enough to begin to want to tell this and share this story as a storyteller?
Well, I was in the classroom. I was actually a doctoral student at the time at the amazing Morgan State University in Baltimore, Maryland, at HBCU, Historically Black College University. So I was there and studying like a normal student, trying to get my PhD on the grind. And I ran across this story. Most of the time we think about lynchings and racial terror. We think about Mississippi. We think about Louisiana. But here I am in Maryland, and I run across these lynchings that took place in Maryland, which in many ways, most people don't think of Maryland as a deep South state. But what I discovered is that there was a number of lynchings that took place here, and the stories of the communities are so similar to what we see in the deep South in places like Mississippi, and there's a disconnect. And so I sought out to salvage the story and to tell the truth about the stories that were going on Maryland's Eastern Shore and throughout the state, the lynchings that happened that were just like the lynchings in Mississippi, as well as a story about the communities that suffered as a result.
When you were motivated as a researcher, how did you research and what was your methodology to actually begin to search and find the essence of what this story hadn't been told, or the region just really could be in denial?
Yeah, I think what we have to realize and recognize is that when we look at archival institutions, libraries, museums, and things like that, historically, they've not been a space. They're not been a space to where our stories are salvaged. If we think about the Black experience historically, in the contemporary sense, for so many times, so many stories have just been suppressed or hidden, right? And if for me as a researcher, what I think about when I think about the Black experience, when I think about the Black perspective, right, I think about what would someone do who did not value your story? Where would they place your story? And oftentimes what we have to realize that our stories are suppressed or hidden, right? And that include in a tangible sense as well. It's not just figuratively, but it's also in terms of a tangible sense, right? So the stories literally are hidden, and that's exactly what happened with this case. I was doing research, looking in the newspapers of the Black press, and the good thing about the Black press is that we were always there on the forefront. And so the Baltimore Afro is an amazing newspaper out of Baltimore. And because of the heroism of their journalists and others, I was able to identify records that were referenced in these newspaper articles. And then I went to the state archives to find these records. And lo and behold, I found and discovered empty boxes that were missing, detailing empty boxes that were supposed to shed light on this lynching. And so that caused me in my head, right, to think about, okay, if they're hiding this, what are they trying to hide? So I began to look deeper. And I went back and connected with an actual state archivist. His name is Chris Haley. He's the nephew of Alex Haley. He works at the Maryland State Archives. And I brought Chris down. I said, Chris, look at these empty boxes. What's going on here? The document says that these records are supposed to be here. Where are they? He was just as baffled as I was. And it was at that time we recognized that a larger cover-up had taken place in the state of Maryland, and these documents had been hidden for over 90 years. And that's when we discovered these documents off-site, and they literally detailed exactly what happened to this individual. I identified eyewitness statements from both black and white witnesses whose story had been hidden. And this individual, Matthew Williams, was lynched. And we have white and black witnesses who were sitting there who told the truth. And one of those, there's a number of black witnesses that my book profiles, but one of the amazing individuals is actually the great grandfather of Jada Pinkett Smith, Maslin Pinkett. And he was a professor at the HBCU that's currently there, University of Maryland Eastern Shore. And he witnessed this lynching and testified before an all-white jury. So I discovered his statements and the statement of others, black people in the community like him, who, for whatever reason, what we know because of white supremacy, their stories were hidden.
So you really, for those of us who don't understand a great Sunday story, when you're reading, how do you invite the reader into this story? Literally, I want to know, because I know you're coming at such a key time. Critical race theory is something that you're just like putting a stamp on it and saying you're hiding it, you hid it, and here's an example. But how do you open this up for us to take this journey?
Yeah, I think we have to recognize that, this case, the case of Matthew Williams, is one of thousands of cases, right? And as black people, I think we have to also recognize, and we cannot wait for the larger public to believe our truths. And for me, what's really drove me to write this book and to do this research was thinking about the stories that happen within families that were passed down, our oral tradition, and the things that we know about in our own community, but because of whatever reasons, because the state and other organizations hid these records, our stories can never properly be validated, right? And so for me, this book has allowed me to show black communities and those who have suffered racial terror, who those families have suffered racial terror, that your trauma and your suffering is real. And it doesn't matter, whether or not the local government or other officials acknowledge it. The truth is there. And I think for me, that's really what this work is about. And I've really been encouraged to connect with the descendants of the victims. So being able to identify the descendants in this process has been an amazing opportunity as well. And they've guided me along this journey. But we really have to think about our own communities, because this is really what this is about. The lynching of Matthew Williams was not about an individual. It was about dismantling a black community. And when we think about lynching, anti-black violence, from Ahmaud Arbery to Breonna Taylor, right? These are modern day lynchings. I call these modern day lynchings. It's all about controlling black people and controlling the black body, right? And controlling our political, social, and economic power. For me, out of all the things that this story is, it's a testament into what links communities, white communities, will go to suppress black power and black economic upward mobility. That's definitely the case here, and that's the case to this day, right? Not only just political upward mobility, but also economic. And so voting, right? Lynching, racial terror, anti-black violence, all this stuff is used to suppress the black vote, to keep us engaged. We have to recognize that and take what we're experiencing as a people and use that as fuel for us to participate in the political process, flip seats, and do what we have to do to take our country back. As a historian, to get to your point about critical race theory, I like to look at, because most people who use the term critical race theory don't really know what critical race theory is, right? And so that's something that I'm definitely cognizant of. And when I deal with people on an everyday basis, most people, it's been used and weaponized in a way that is out of control at this point. And so instead of trying to chase down that dog, right, I think what's more important is for us to recenter and say, look, you can talk about critical race theory, we can think about critical race theory, but the evidence, if we're able to present our truth, it's self-explanatory. Like if you read my book, you will be able to see the evidence is on our side. These theories came after the fact in terms of them being hypotheses around what we believe is literally the systemic issues. But here the book lays out the evidence that yes, a black man was lynched, a community was targeted, and there was a systemic effort that's documented to do this, right? To dismantle this community, right? And so if we're able to tell our stories and our truth, we don't have to necessarily debate about what it's called, but we should be able to share those truths. And that's kind of like where I'm at with it. That's where I'm at on the spectrum around critical race theory.
I understand that. I think that this is one of those empty box syndromes. Yeah, and I think the courage. But as a storyteller, what are you also saying that we as a community, Black community, should read this book and process our own process, our own healing? How do we share this as families on Sunday morning, Sunday afternoon? Read it as a brothers, read it as our book clubs. And what should we take away from this particular body canon of work that you brought to our attention?
Yeah, I think the main takeaway of this book is going to be about the power and resiliency of Black people and of our community. In spite of all of the things that have happened to us historically and throughout the history of this country, specifically with this lynching, we still are resilient and we're still alive and fighting and living to tell the tale. But I think we also have to recognize that our stories are disappearing, right? For whatever reasons. We know, as I mentioned earlier, most institutions, white archival institutions and repositories and government records organizations, they're just not in the business of preserving and taking care of our records. And we have to recognize that. So I think we also have to, as a people, begin to really honor, value, and learn how to salvage our stories, our history. Sitting down, talking with grandparents and others before they move on and transition is essential. We have to keep these stories alive because we cannot wait on white institutions and others to tell our stories. We have to be the keepers of our own narrative and our own story.
So when you bring it back and we think about the story in Tulsa and just really working to control the Black narrative through this particular lynchings, for somebody who doesn't know, how do they share through this book? How do you teach a child the power of how they attack our community or community members to shut down economic development in a community?
Yeah, I mean, this case is one of the signature cases that I think is overlooked. Because when we think about racial massacres, we think about Tulsa, that is the standard. We also know about Rosewood. But what this case shows and what the case of Matthew Williams shows is that other communities were targeted and lynchings were just used as justifications to dismantle these communities. And this really took place, which makes this lynching unique, around the Great Depression. So there's poverty everywhere. There's also a space where, but you have Black people, as we've always done. We've made a way out of no way. So as Black people, we've always, made a way out of no way. And as a result of that, that causes jealousy to breed within communities, specifically within white communities, poorer communities. And that is definitely the case that we see here in Salisbury, Maryland, but we also see it throughout the country. That it's actually during the Great Depression and during economic strife that this tension arises. It happened in the 1890s, which is one of the reasons why we had the Wilmington Massacre, right? Because you see Black people who, for whatever reasons, should not be surviving, but they are in front of their former oppressors. This causes strife, anger to emerge, and whites begin to directly target the Black businesses and Black communities. And what was astonishing about this lynching, after I did the investigation, was that the lynching took place and was used to dismantle the entire Black business district. And so you had Black homes, barbershops. There was 19 Black businesses that were actually in Salisbury, Maryland, called the Georgetown District. And at the time of the lynching, there were 19 Black businesses and other institutions, including a school. To this day, there's only one building that remains, and that is the Charles Chipman Cultural Center, which is the former church where the lynching victim Matthew Williams went to. That's the only building left. They even exhumed the Black bodies in the Black cemetery. And so this is one of those cases that I think we all could learn from, because we think of Tulsa, we think of direct violence. It was burning. Everything took place within the course of a couple of days. But this is what I call a slow burn that we see happening throughout a lot of our communities, where communities are dismantled through land dispossession, through other sinister systemic acts that are equally as traumatic for our communities.
Well, I think Ahmaud Arbery clearly demonstrated how the system of oppressors could agree that
Definitely.
nothing had happened
Yep.
and tell his mother that literally your son was a criminal and that's why he was put down. And I use the word put down because clearly he was murdered.
Yep.
And when we see that, what here? Why Mr. Matthews? Why this particular gentleman?
Yeah, yeah. Well, his story was significant because it was the way it took place. I think for me, with Matthew Williams, it was the fact that, during this time, the whole pretext of the lynching really kind of like is what drew me attention to it, right? It's the whole idea that this young man, the story was that he actually loaned money. He was very prosperous. He was pretty much they were calling him someone who was a Negro who was stepping out of line. He actually had money in two bank accounts. He was actually loaning money to poor white people in the community, believe it or not. And so this caused him to be a target. And the original story is a traditional story that, he attacked someone and he had to be lynched. But as I did more research, I figured out that his lynching was literally the climax to an assault and racial terror on the entire black community that was thriving during the Great Depression period. Right. And so and in the investigation records, I find notes from those who were involved and who lynched Matthew Williams saying that we couldn't get the other Negroes. And so he was the best person to get. We had to put them in line because they were stepping out of line. And of course, that is easily translated to, as I mentioned earlier, that economic success, the political power, the ability to mobilize. These are all things that were made the white community fearful, especially when a lot of them were transitioning and suffering as a result of the Great Depression. How dare these Negroes, right, continue to prosper and survive, and even loan money to our brothers and sisters, and while we're sitting here staring in the face of the Great Depression.
So we've had an entire what they want to say was a coup,
Yeah.
really an attack on the Capitol. Um, Maybe for those who would read this book, should they see that this could happen again to Black people? That there are white people who would do this again?
Oh yeah, and I think and that's something I talk about in my book. In the intro of my book, I lay that out. I talk about that actual day. I wrote the forward on that day. I had to take a break because it was so traumatic. Right? I'm sitting here watching this TV and I'm studying mob psychology. I'm looking at the ways in which white mobs form historically. And it's really coming to life in front of my very own eyes. Right? On January the 6th, we see this mob spirit that is alive and well. Right. Originally, we think that this is something that has went away, but I believe it has been dormant. And with the previous president, Donald Trump, he made it okay. He put it was in vogue now to be able to be overtly racist. But I think what's something that's equally as problematic and that we have to address and confront as Black people is this more systemic racism that is less overt. Right. And so we do have to deal with the crazy vigilantes which emerged on January the 6th. And what's also important to realize for Black people as well, and for as a country, the ways in which systemic racism infiltrates all of our institutions, right? And what was really astonishing to me, not astonishing, but very consistent with what I knew about mob psychology. When we first saw what was going on, I think it was Representative Clyburn who said it was almost as if some of the white police officers turned the other way. This, if you read my book, you'll see throughout this book, this is the same type of rationale and logic that's being utilized by members of the police department during the times of these lynchings. Some of them are saying literally, while the man's being lynched, the most humane thing for us to do is direct traffic. These are their statements. They're looking the other way. It's almost as if they're in cahoots with whoever is involved. I don't know if that's necessarily the case with January the 6th, but I definitely think that the part of our legal machinery, when we look at not confronting racism and not dealing with race in this country, we have to recognize our institutions are a part of the problem. The way our officers are trained is a part of the problem. So we have to, recognize that. But I definitely think there's a potential for these things to continue to happen if we continue to allow these lies to be told through social media, through all of these various forms of media. Then yes, these things can continue to happen. And unfortunately, January 6th represents the power of white supremacy when it goes unchecked.
So, for those who haven't had this opportunity to really read this book on Sunday Story, tell us a short story, if you would, from one of your favorite chapters that inspired you to continue on, to know that you were on the right track.
Yeah. Well, one of my favorite stories is actually the stories of Maslin Pinkett, who, as I mentioned, is descendant of Jada Pinkett Smith, her great grandfather. I'm looking through the actual statements and I'm writing and I'm trying to figure out, because the whole myth is that we were silent. Black people were horrified. We didn't say anything. And that's what's told. And so I'm thinking, I'm probably not going to find anybody who truly spoke up. That's what the lies being told. When we look at books on lynching and racial terror, we are always hiding somewhere scared. And whenever I look through the Attorney General's notes from the grand jury hearing, I saw the individual Maslin Pinkett, and I began to look at his statements. And he was among another black individual named Dr. A.D. Brown. They begin to stare these men in the face and say, this is who did it. They name names. And when we think about heroes in the black community, and we think about these lies that have been told about who we are as a people, that we are always fearful, and deservingly so. I mean, I think in terms of terror, if it takes a lot of guts to stand up to an all-white jury in a community, an all-white jury and an all-white police department who's all involved in lynching someone. Everybody in the room knew that everybody who was a part of this community knew who did it. The police officers were involved, yet these black men, right, and some black women whose stories are just not coming to light, stood up, and their voices were suppressed, not through their families and not through history, but by the state. These records were hidden, so I would never know about Maslin Pinkett's contribution or others. And so that story for me, seeing and picturing them in the actual grand jury hearing, sharing their truth and standing firm, and saying, regardless of what you can do to my body, this truth is going to be told, was just so powerful for me. And that's one of the major areas of the book that I take pride in, because it came at the very end of my work. I was almost finished with the book. It was at that time that I discovered these stories, and that gave me hope to continue.
So the box is empty. You literally go and Alex Haley's great nephew?
No, his nephew, Chris Haley.
Chris Haley is there, and now you are on this journey.
Yep.
So you're the next generation Alex Haley, telling a story about our community that we don't know. And how do you find the details?
Well, yeah, and so it really, basically what I did, I thought about it, I talked to Chris about it. This was a decision. I knew then that there was something at play here, because we knew that the records were supposed to be in the box, because it has there's a description, there's a finding aid. It says this is there. It says investigation records for lynching, and we go to the box and nothing's there. Now, for me, that's automatic sign. Like, I'm already thinking cover up, but I'm trying to go through the process. And for me and for Chris, it was like, hold on, this is something, something's missing here. There's something off. Either someone moved these purposefully, either they're put in a different spot, but nonetheless, they're supposed to be here. That caused me to hunt even harder. And so it is at that time when I went back and I went from, I actually talked about this in the book. I stayed for a week, coming back every day after teaching my class at the community college, looking for something. I knew something was there. I just knew, again, I'm thinking, it's almost like, where's the trash? Because that's probably where we put our stuff at. And so literally what I ended up finding out was that it was stored on an off-site facility, and the records were called lynching investigation records. Never have been looked at. They've just been hidden off-site in a storage facility in Baltimore. And it was at that time I called up the records. It took me 4 days to get them. They arrived in a Home Depot box. Everything was thrown on top of each other. It was a mess. There was photographs from the lynching. There was thousands of pages of statements from eyewitnesses. from Black people who people have said they were silent. They told their story. We would never have known this, and it really took me like not giving up and being inspired by Chris and others to continue, right? And I think it's just so empowering, and for me to also be able to give this book as a gift to the descendants. That's the other part of this. I was able to find the living descendants of Matthew Williams and share this with them. And the afterword of the book is actually written by Miss Jeannie Jones, who's a former, believe it or not, radio personality in DC, who I was able to track down, and who's now in California, who literally had no clue that her loved one was lynched. All she knew was that around the 30s, her family left Salisbury just because of economic reasons. But we know now it's because of racial terror.
Super. Hey, ladies and gentlemen, it is great. Can you show us a copy of this book?
Yes, right behind me. Here you go. Right here.
The Silent Shore. Be sure to support our dear Dr. Chavis. He spent a ton of time and is bringing truth to light. And we really appreciate all that you've given us here at Sunday Stories. We've got more Sunday Stories coming to you. Don't forget to support Dr. Chavis for all that he's done. Dr. Charles Chavis, look him up. Let's get this book and support him. I'm Munson Steed, and this is Sunday Story on Rolling Out.